flying at nearly half the speed of light, dodging and diving amongst a melee of titanic starships are Peregrine fighters, flown by daring pilots, when one wrong move, one moment's hesitation, means sudden death. These pilots can only go off guts and instinct, pushing themselves and their craft to their limit. However, they are not alone. Closing from above are Cardassian Kopesh fighters. Like their Federation counterparts, these brave men and women fly at the edge of the envelope, engaging in lightning-fast duels as pilot is pitted against pilot in one-on-one duels of daring and snake-like reflexes. These are the dogfights of the Dominion War. During the Dominion War, fighter craft played a small yet important role. Every combatant of the war would go on to use fighters in some capacity, and they would be employed at most major engagements. Yet despite this, the use of fighter craft in the modern battlespace was unthinkable only a decade before. The received wisdom in Starfleet and the fleets of most Alpha Quadrant powers was that fighters were too small and vulnerable in space combat. Additionally, it was difficult to transport effective numbers of fighter craft on board ships, which generally only carried half a dozen auxiliary craft. And thirdly, the lack of small warp drives, which meant that such craft were only effective at sublight combat and could be easily evaded by starships with warp drive. However, the outbreak of the Maquis conflict in 2370 brought these long-held assumptions into doubt, as the Maquis were able to outmaneuver and evade both Cardassian and Federation starships, and in larger numbers could even overwhelm a starship. The Maquis ships were also agile and carried various countermeasures, which allowed them to evade otherwise lethal fire from capital ships. While the Condor-class Courier was the most widely employed by the Maquis, the smaller Peregrine-class fighter would prove the most successful. Being newer, smaller, and more agile than the Condor, it made an excellent fighter craft, and was favoured in rapid strike missions. Its success in its service with the Maquis caused Starfleet to adopt the Peregrine as a shipboard space superiority fighter, with the production model integrating many of the modifications made by the Maquis, as well as up-to-date Starfleet technology. The Peregrine fighter has a length of 25 meters and a wingspan of 24 meters. Its twin micro-Cochrane engines allow it to reach up to warp 4.5 and give it unparalleled agility at impulse. It is armed with a nose-mounted Type 10 phaser, 6 wing-mounted Type 4 pulse phasers, and 6 wing-mounted hardpoints to carry ordnance. It is operated by a crew of 2, a pilot and weapons officer. This impressive armament, combined with a good balance of speed and maneuverability, made the Peregrine an ideal space superiority fighter. However, the Peregrine's dominance did not go unchallenged. Also appearing during the Maquis conflict was the Cardassian Kopesh class fighter. With a length of 14.5 meters and a wingspan of 7 meters, the Kopesh is significantly faster and more maneuverable than its adversary, though its warp capabilities are limited and it is unwieldy in atmospheric flight. Yet, with its dual disruptor cannons and payload of 12 anti-fighter missiles, it presents a significant threat to any would-be Maquis raiders. During the conflict, the Cardassians were not limited to defensive actions and used another, often more feared craft to carry out reprisals, the Linar-class bomber. Originally adapted from a civilian light transport, the Linar has a wingspan of 18 meters and a length of 15 meters. It can carry 6 photon torpedoes, but more commonly carries a pair of bombardment torpedoes, which have twice the yield of standard photon torpedoes, or a pair of long-range stand-off torpedoes, allowing the liner to engage targets at long range. This potent payload, combined with the liner's respectable handling and warp capability, made it a unique terror among the Maquis, able to obliterate colonies with little to no warning. Both Starfleet and the Cardassian Central Command recognized the potential of such craft in large-scale fleet actions and began integrating them into their fleets. Newer and larger vessels like the Galaxy and Akira class could accommodate a complement of 10 to 15 fighters and were effective capital ships in their own right. Yet most Peregrine squadrons were assigned to older, smaller vessels pressed into service as carriers, such as the Constellation, which could only accommodate 8 fighters using folding wings, and even the purpose-built 23rd century Saint Nazaire class carrier struggled to accommodate their newly issued fighters. By contrast, the Cardassians had no such difficulties, as despite seeing use among civilian militias, both the Kopesh and Linar had been designed with military use in mind, and could be easily accommodated aboard most large cruisers. Additionally, during the 2360s, the Cardassians began constructing dedicated carriers such as the Tournen class. At 716 meters long and 230 meters wide, the Tournen can carry up to 60 auxiliary craft, including fighters and bombers, launching from 8 shuttle bays. This fighter wing serves as the primary armament of the Tournen, which itself only mounts point defense cannons to ward off potential counterstrike by enemy fighters, and therefore remains vulnerable to attack by enemy starships. Yet, when operating as part of a fleet, the Tournen and its fighters can augment the capabilities of the fleet, allowing for more engagement options to a fleet commander. One such instance can be observed during the Battle of Epsilon Eridani. The Dominion were faced by a series of formidable, layered defences, which were increasingly common in the core Federation systems. These included clusters of phaser and torpedo turrets, which with overlapping fields of fire could quickly destroy even the strongest of starships. However, they were not designed to engage small fighter craft, and so on April 8th, a force of over 300 Cardassian fighters and bombers attacked Eridani with the objective of destroying the turrets, allowing their capital ships to follow. Leading his wing from the carrier Hurricane is Glyn Fared. They quickly destroy their first target. Yet as they close on their second target, they are engaged by a wing of Peregrines from the carrier group Skarsgård. Fared orders his fighters to take the lead. As the Peregrines enter missile range, he launches a volley. Forced to evade the incoming missiles, the Peregrines break formation. Fared seizes the chance and shoots down a fighter on the fringes, and then leads his wing into the attack. He pulls an 80-degree climb and hits the underside of a Peregrine. But another is on his tail and closing fast. In a split second, Fared pulls a high G maneuver, cutting thrust, flipping 180 and gunning the throttle, shooting past his pursuer and through the melee, taking out another Peregrine in his dive. By now the bombers have struck their second target and were moving to strike a third, but the Peregrines would not give up the chase so easily. Yet they struggled to keep pace with the faster Cardassian fighters, and Fared was able to rendezvous with the other wings. Seeing a bomber pursued by 2 Peregrines, he locks on with his last 2 missiles and fires. One of the enemy fighters is hit, but his wingman evades and flies straight at Fared, blazing away with his phasers. Fared dives to avoid the hail of fire, but the Peregrine is on his tail and is ready to make the kill, only for him to be hit from behind by Fared's wingman, covering his comrade. The 2 fighters rejoin their comrades, fending off 4 wings of Peregrines as their bombers move to escape the system before bugging out themselves. In total, the Cardassians lost 65 craft in the raid, while only destroying 36 Peregrines and 4 emplacements. With such casualty rates, one might wonder why anyone would volunteer to fly and fight in such fragile craft. The answer lies in men like Glyn Fared. For his actions that day, he was awarded the Order of the Sword Silver and would go on to earn many other awards, flying some 50 combat sorties during the war and notching 37 confirmed kills. He survived the war and went on to be a key figure in the Cardassian Republic, eventually passing away in 2436. It is exceptional individuals like Fared that became the face of the fighter corps, arguably drawing in a character of officer not normally seen in Starfleet. Bold, headstrong, and instinctive. Statistics gathered by both sides during the war in fact suggested that the longer a pilot served, the less likely they were to die. And so the most dangerous point in any pilot's career was their first 3 months in the service. While many often imagine these pilots engaging in honourable duels with their rivals, this comprised only 20% of combat sorties during the war. Far more common and far more dangerous were the anti-ship sorties, mostly occurring as part of a general engagement between enemy fleets. Fighters were used to screen fleets as they deploy for battle, as well as skirmish with the enemy line, probing for weaknesses and disrupting their formations, ahead of a capital ship assault. Once the capital ships engage, it was the task of the fighters to harry any damaged enemy vessels, preventing them from recovering and regrouping. Nowhere is this vital yet dangerous role that fighters play in the battlespace more apparent than in Operation Return, in which over 900 Federation Peregrine fighters were deployed. While the enemy fleet numbered some 1,200 ships, the Peregrines would solely focus their attention on the Cardassian 9th and 18th Orders, which formed the centre of the Dominion lines. Yet, unlike in most engagements where the Peregrines would be supported by destroyer units, in this instance the destroyers were held back. Instead, Starfleet hoped that the number and concentration of fighters would be enough in itself. However, one officer who would go on to be a vocal critic of this tactic was Lieutenant Commander Natua from the carrier Saint Omer. Her wing would form part of that fateful 9th wave. Up to this point, the fighters had met little opposition. The Cardassians only had a fraction of the fighters with which to defend themselves, and the flak from the cruisers had been comparatively light. Yet, when her wing went in and knocked out a Cardassian cruiser, the hitherto stoic Cardassians were finally provoked, sending their light division after the fighter wings. While this was precisely what was planned by Starfleet, it did not appear so to Natua, and her comrades were relentlessly pursued by a Cardassian skirmish line. The smaller, more agile vessels were able to keep the Peregrines in their sights, and quickly ate away at the wing, killing the commander. With no cover, Natua did her best to lead the fighters back to the carrier, but by the time she did, only 12 of the 44-strong wing remained. While many remember the opportunity created by the fighters in Operation Return, few remember the horrific price paid by the pilots for their bold, unsupported attacks. Yet, it provided Starfleet with a valuable learning experience regarding the capabilities and limitations of fighters. Throughout the rest of the war, fighters would be employed more carefully, and their casualty rates would improve at a commensurate rate. Even so, using fighters in a starship-dominated battlespace remained a dangerous job. There is, however, another dimension of the battlespace in which fighters play a key role and need not cower in the shadows of starships, and that is the dimension of suborbital combat. For while the void of space is dominated by majestic starships, they have little sway beyond the lifeless void. One may capture a star system, drive out the enemy fleet, but it means naught if one cannot take and hold the true prize: planets, cradles of life and resources in the empty void of space. Unlike starships, fighters are all built with atmospheric capability and have the vital role of protecting and supporting landing craft in the initial stages of a planetary invasion, where starships are unable to venture too close for fear of planetary defences. Fighters and shuttlecraft are able to slip through and deploy troops and secure a beachhead on the planet's surface and create a safe approach corridor for starships. No fleet was more proficient and practiced in these tactics than the Klingon defense forces. As the Allies assumed a more offensive posture in the second half of the war, the Klingons would often be seen at the tip of the spear. And essential to this aggressive role was the ToeDouche interceptor, operated by a lone pilot, 18 meters long, with a 31-meter wingspan. The ToeDouche was the most agile fighter of the war, emphasizing above all else maneuverability and firepower, at the expense of protection and long-range capability. Unlike other fighters, which have a broad mission capability, the ToeDouche was intended as a defensive fighter, protecting capital ships from enemy fighters and escorting and supporting troop shuttles during planetary landings. Nowhere was this capability more on display than at the Battle of Chintoka. After defeating the Cardassian weapon platforms, the Klingons led a ground assault on Chintoka 4, with 60 landing craft launching from 8 D-10 assault cruisers, carrying 1,200 troops to the desert surface in just the first wave. The planet was protected by a dampening field, which dispersed all scanner and transporter beams, making it impossible for the Klingons to see what awaited them on the surface. And so, as they broke through the planet's atmosphere, they were greeted by heavy ground flak and a squadron of Cardassian fighters. The two escorting fighter squadrons split up to neutralize the threats to the shuttles. Sergeant Baroque led his 8 fighters against the ground batteries, climbing to just outside their effective range and cruising until he was directly above them, and then entering a full-speed dive, blazing away with his disruptor cannons, only breaking off at an altitude of 2,000 meters. His fellow pilots followed suit and successfully destroyed 5 batteries, clearing a path for the shuttles. Meanwhile, Flight Sergeant Ferris engaged the Cardassians with confidence. Initially, the Cardassians seemed to have the advantage, shooting down 2 fighters, yet, as the dogfight steadily dropped to lower and lower altitudes, the Klingons gained the advantage and were able to consistently outmaneuver the Cardassians, shooting down 6 fighters before the Cardassians bugged out. Yet even as they safely escorted their troops to the surface, the job of the ToeDouche was far from over. They now had to provide air cover and close air support to the landing parties. One squadron remained on station to provide this support, while the other returned with the shuttles to the assault ships to refuel and rearm. Over the next 5 hours, the 2 squadrons between them destroyed 12 emplacements, 7 tanks, 3 electronic warfare platforms, 11 transports, and 15 soft targets, including the staging area for a Cardassian counterattack. Yet, these daring acts of bravado came at great cost, with the Klingons losing 5 out of 16 fighters in this one operation. And such casualty rates, particularly among the Klingons, were quite common during planetary landing operations. Yet it is in operations such as these that fighters prove to be an essential asset in the modern battle space. And so, in spite of these casualty rates, there were always more willing volunteers, and regardless of whether they were Federation, Cardassian, or Klingon, they were all the same: young, ambitious, and headstrong, with more courage and patriotic fervour than sense. And as a result, many in the youngest generation, barely over the cusp of adulthood, would lose their lives before they had truly begun, all in a war started by their elders, not realizing that it would be their children who would pay the price. Yet, as dutiful children of Andor, Earth, Cronus, and Cardassia, they willingly gave their lives, trusting that their cause was right and just. These are the young men and women who fought and died in the dogfights of the Dominion War.